Today we will be speaking with Professor Peter Klein from the University of Missouri, author of many books and distinguished publications. His main fields of interest is entrepreneurship, business administration, strategy. So we will be discussing some specifics of the field with him. Dr. Klein, thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me here.
First of all, what does the term entrepreneurship mean in the 21st century, and how the meaning has evolved during these years?
It's a great question to start with because there's a huge amount of writing on entrepreneurship, many books and articles. People in government, NGOs talk about how entrepreneurship is very important for growing an economy, especially in a transition economy like Georgia's. Unfortunately, there's not very much consistency on how the word entrepreneur and the words entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial are used. Many times in these writings and when policymakers give speeches, they use the word without really having a very precise meaning in mind because it sounds like something we want to have. In English in particular, the word entrepreneur, aside from any specific technical meaning it might have, it just sounds good. It's like it's a compliment to say to someone, well, you're very entrepreneurial. It means you have a lot of initiative, you're very creative, you can think on your feet, you make good decisions. Now, in a more technical sense, there are many different definitions that scholars use. Often they mean people who are self-employed and people who start new companies. Sometimes they refer to companies themselves being entrepreneurial, meaning companies that innovate a lot, maybe companies that are small and young but growing very fast. Sometimes they mean more of an abstract sort of attitude or a way of thinking, like creativity, leadership, initiative, awareness of opportunities. The challenge in talking about entrepreneurship and studying entrepreneurship is that it's not always clear what people mean when they use those words. So it's very important to ask particular researchers or particular policymakers, when you say we need more entrepreneurship, what exactly do you mean? They may not always have the same thing in mind.
Yeah, but in many countries, entrepreneur and businessman is kind of like synonymous.
Yes.
But in your book,
yes.
You distinguish between
Yes.
these terms. And what
Yes.
is the thinking?
So anyone who is involved in commerce, as a manager, as an employee, we might say, well, he's in business. What do you do for a living? Well, I'm a businessman. By entrepreneur, we usually have something more specific in mind. It is a person who has control over important resources, someone who has to make critical decisions about how those resources will be used. In the way I describe it in my book, someone who has to manage the uncertainty that we find in the world around us, not just market uncertainty and technological uncertainty, but political uncertainty and so forth. The person who really makes critical judgments about how to deal with uncertainty, that is the entrepreneurial function, as opposed to the management function or the accounting function or whatever, all of which are part of business. Now there's a slightly different way to answer your question as well, is that in the loose sense of making good decisions about how to bear uncertainty, all of us do that every day to some degree. So even in everyday life, we have to look for opportunities to make ourselves better off. We have to exercise judgment about what to do and what not to do. So all of us are entrepreneurial a little bit every day. But usually when we study entrepreneurship, when we talk about it, that's not the kind of entrepreneurship that we're interested in. We're interested in the kind of entrepreneurship that moves the market, that affects the lives of many, many people. So, Peter Klein as an entrepreneur, that's not really all that interesting to people. But Steve Jobs as an entrepreneur, Bill Gates as an entrepreneur, Richard Branson as an entrepreneur, that's much more interesting and important to the economy as a whole.
You mentioned self-employment and decisions that self-employed people often make. In Georgia, for example, the number of self-employed people is more than employed. But can we say that there is some kind of correlation between self-employment and the level of entrepreneurship?
Some studies look at finance. How big is the venture capital market? That more venture capital correlates with more entrepreneurship. But to answer your question, I think the relationship between something like self-employment and entrepreneurship as an abstract function, there certainly is a relationship, but it isn't perfect, right? I mean, certainly self-employed people have to exercise good judgment. They have to be aware of opportunities in the environment. They have to make good decisions about using their resources. But they're not the only actors in society who also bear those kinds of responsibilities.
So we can actually say that there are some kinds of internationally comparable indicators that that measure entrepreneurship.
Yes, absolutely. There's a number of organizations and groups that try to do exactly this. There's the World Bank attempts to track entrepreneurial activity across countries. They look primarily at things like startup companies, and the bank is particularly interested in sort of institutional or regulatory features that either make it easier or harder to engage in those activities. That's been very important from that strand of research is the cost of establishing a new business. The World Bank keeps a database of how much does it cost in terms of the number of days you have to wait and the amount of money you pay in fees and licenses and so on. And I understand that Georgia actually ranks very high in the good sense. In Georgia, it only takes 1 day or 2 days to establish a new company. In France, it takes much longer. Actually, in the United States, it's much harder and much costlier to start a new business than it is in Georgia. So if we think that new business startups if that's important for economic growth, for economic development, then we would want to encourage an environment where it's relatively easy for people to start companies. And groups like the World Bank try to track this so they can argue in favor of better rules in different countries.
And since we're talking about different indexes, Georgia usually ranks very well, as you also mentioned, on indexes that measure like liberal business environment, but has quite low scores in indexes that measure specifically entrepreneurship and innovation. And this tendency of like weak innovation is usually common for developing countries as well. How do you think? What is the reason for this tendency, and what are some?
All of the research on entrepreneurship and on economic development suggests that, good policies, a liberal, business-friendly environment with strong protection for property rights, a sound currency, minimal government intervention in the economy, that these are all necessary for entrepreneurship and innovation and economic development to take place. However, it appears that there may be other factors that are important too. So those good policies may be necessary, but they might not be sufficient. In other words, they don't guarantee that people will use their economic freedom in any particular way. One of the challenges here is that, look at the history of other countries in the last 200 years that went through rapid economic development, modernized industrialization. Of course, Britain and Europe during the Industrial Revolution, the United States during the commercial and industrial periods of development. There was a lot of entrepreneurship during those periods, but there were also a lot of large enterprises, the steel mills and the weaving factories and so on. And most countries that have experienced rapid economic growth did go through a phase with very large enterprises where many people in the economy were not themselves entrepreneurs, but were employees working in the factory. Now, because when we look back on those times now, we tend to think, oh, those were very poor working conditions. People don't want to work in factories. They want to run their own businesses. That's fine, but we really don't know if it's possible for a country to go through strong economic growth and become much more prosperous only through small business and startups without also having large factories and maybe foreign direct investment and so on. We would like to think that that's possible, and many people believe that small enterprise leads to a more sustainable kind of growth than having, large multinationals set up manufacturing, because they may take those away. That isn't teaching skills to people and so forth. So having more sustainable bottom-up development seems like a good idea. Unfortunately, it might be the case that that isn't going to be enough for a country like Georgia. Maybe there needs to be more multinationals, maybe more FDI, maybe more big factories. We just don't know for sure.
In Georgia, the main slogan of Rose Revolution was Georgia without corruption.
Yes.
And since then, perception, according to international indexes, has fallen tenfold. What are some other institutional approaches that help entrepreneurship?
Really, what government policy should aim at is fostering, an environment, creating an environment without corruption, with stable and secure property titles, with free markets in which people can exchange goods and services, free movement of labor, free movement of capital, and so on, so that entrepreneurs can do the things that they do best: assembling resources, combining resources, introducing new products and services, creating business enterprises, dissolving those business enterprises and changing them, and so forth. What I'm concerned about is there are some other development models which want the government to be more of an active manager of particular kinds of entrepreneurship. For instance, one of the most famous examples of a specific area where there is a cluster, a concentration of high-valued entrepreneurial activity is Silicon Valley in California, right? There are government planners all over the world who look at Silicon Valley and they say, wow, I want that. I want one of those in my country. I want that in my state, in my region. So what do? They think, well, we can come up with a plan. We can have the next Silicon Valley be in Tbilisi, and we're going to buy some land, and we're going to subsidize particular businesses to get them to move here. We're going to build certain kinds of facilities, incubators, as they call them. We're going to build laboratories. We're going to give cash to particular business people if they're willing to locate here and do certain things. The historical record suggests that governments are not very good at doing that. That these clusters like Silicon Valley, they emerge from the bottom up. You really can't plan them. You can't design one and put it here. So attempts to micromanage the entrepreneurial process from above by the state simply have not proven very successful in the past.
Could you please elaborate on the role of management education in the society and the relationship it may have to the latest crisis?
Sure, I think management education is, of course, extremely important. There's the broad sense of management, managing one's time, being a good steward of resources, that to me should be part of a liberal education, along with mathematics and literature and science and history and so on. In terms of specific techniques that we teach in business schools, I teach a lot of business students, and I think it's very important that business students understand basic marketing, accounting, finance, human resources, and so on. However, I'm not as certain that we can teach entrepreneurship in schools. Now, there are many, many universities around the world, and even high schools, where there are courses to train students how to be entrepreneurs, meaning how to be business owners, how to start their own companies, how to get patents, etc. It's not clear that entrepreneurship in that sense is something that we can really teach. Well, we can teach some basic technical skills, how to get the license to start a business. You can teach somebody how to do that. Can you teach creativity? Can you teach awareness or alertness? Can you teach good judgment? I mean, that's harder to say. Of course, in the fine arts, for many, many years, there's kind of a debate in education. Did Picasso have to go to school to learn how to be Picasso? No. I mean, almost nobody thinks that great artists are great because of what they were taught in art school. Likewise with entrepreneurs. I mean, we have a lot of anecdotal evidence, right, of people like Bill Gates. He dropped out of college. A lot of very important entrepreneurs, a lot of important business people didn't go to college or didn't go to a prestigious college, don't have an MBA degree, and so forth. So I'm all in favor of management education and teaching about entrepreneurship as we teach many different subjects. But I guess my view is that if we as educators can try to do the same thing that policymakers should do, namely help to create an environment in which people who have entrepreneurial ability can exercise it, that's really the best that we can do.
Could we say that economic development is the effect for which entrepreneurship is a cause?
I don't know that I would want to put it quite that strongly. I certainly think that entrepreneurship has a strong and positive effect on economic development, but there may be other things besides entrepreneurship, meaning small business and startups and self-employment and so on, that also contribute to economic growth. If we mean entrepreneurship in the broad functional sense of making good decisions, exercising good judgment, then yes, of course, I think that is exactly what strong economic development means. One other point too that is worth making, that there's a lot of interest in what people call sometimes social enterprise, non-profit enterprise, people who are trying to help with poverty in Africa or reducing disease, encouraging, protecting the environment and this sort of thing. Now those are outcomes that may not show up in GDP statistics, the usual kinds of indicators of economic growth. So they may be achieving the entrepreneur's own objectives, but the entrepreneur may not be all that interested in economic development. He or she may be interested in the environment or having a better lifestyle for themselves, the satisfaction of being your own boss. And those things may not be reflected in growth statistics.
Recently there has been this tendency of pegging social responsibility to businesses and entrepreneurship. Yes. What is the responsibility of entrepreneurs and businesses?
My own view is very close to that that was famously expressed by well-known American economist Milton Friedman many years ago in an article on social responsibility, where he criticized the social responsibility movement. And his argument was really that what a business should try to do is make money, because where does that money go? Well, it goes to the business owner, it goes to the partners, it goes to the shareholders, and then they can decide if they want to give their money to charity, if they want to spend their money on protecting the environment, or whatever social cause it might be. That you don't want the company itself to be donating to charity or protecting the environment. Let individuals use their own money to do that. The corporation's job is just to make money for those individuals. I mean, my own view is very close to that certainly if individuals who are in charge of their own enterprises wish to devote their time and effort toward charitable activities or environmental activities or whatever, obviously they have the perfect right to do that, and that's fine. I'm a little bit concerned about calls to use regulation and other kinds of intervention to kind of require that all businesses be green or be progressive or be socially responsible or whatever, because I just don't think businesses are very good at that. Businesses are good at making money. We as individuals are much better judges of where our money should be spent in terms of these broader kinds of social goals.
Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure.